The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of the county courthouse as Maria Gonzalez joined the stream of people making their way inside. She paused for a moment, looking up at the imposing stone columns that framed the entrance, took a deep breath and adjusted the worn leather strap of her shoulder bag. Maria was not what most people pictured when they thought of someone heading to court. At 52, her appearance spoke of a life of practical concerns rather than legal battles. Her hands were slightly rough from years of gardening, her face weathered by sun and marked with laugh lines around her eyes. Today she wore what many would consider her good clothes, a simple blue blouse tucked into jeans that, while clean and neat, had clearly seen many wash cycles. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, and she wore minimal makeup, just a touch of lipstick applied somewhat hastily on the bus ride over. As she made her way through the security checkpoint, Maria fumbled with her bag, dropping her keys and drawing impatient looks from the court officers. Her cheeks flushed slightly as she gathered her belongings. "First time in court?" asked the security guard, not unkindly, as he handed back her ancient flip phone. "It shows that much, huh?" Maria replied with a nervous smile. Her slight accent became more pronounced when she was anxious. "Courtroom 3B is on the 3rd floor," the guard said, pointing toward the elevators. "Good luck with whatever brings you here." The elevator was crowded with lawyers in crisp suits, their confidence filling the small space as completely as their cologne. Maria pressed herself into the corner, clutching her bag to her chest. She couldn't help but notice how out of place she looked reflected in the polished elevator doors, a simple woman surrounded by professionals. When the doors opened on the 3rd floor, Maria hesitated, letting the others exit first. The hallway buzzed with activity. Lawyers huddled with clients, court reporters rushed by with coffee cups, and harried-looking people sat on benches, waiting for their cases to be called. Maria checked the small piece of paper in her hand, several times confirming the courtroom number before slowly approaching the heavy wooden doors of 3B. Inside, the room was larger than she had imagined, with high ceilings, dark wood paneling, and rows of bench seating. A few people were already seated, their voices hushed as if in church. Finding a spot in the back row, Maria settled in and opened her bag. Unlike the sleek briefcases around her, her bag contained a worn notepad, several carefully paper-clipped documents, and a dog-eared copy of Property Law Basics borrowed from the public library. She had spent weeks preparing, staying up late after finishing her shifts at the local diner where she worked as a cook. The dispute that had brought her here seemed simple enough to Maria. Her small house sat on a half-acre lot that had been in her family for generations. 6 months ago, a developer had purchased the large property next door and immediately began construction on a luxury home development. Within weeks, their heavy machinery had repeatedly crossed onto her property, damaging her carefully tended vegetable garden and taking down a row of apple trees her grandfather had planted decades ago. When she'd complained, they'd sent over a young man in an expensive suit who explained that according to updated survey data, part of what she thought was her land actually belonged to them. He'd offered her a check for $5,000 to settle the matter, a sum that seemed substantial until a friend pointed out it was a fraction of the property's worth. Maria's thoughts were interrupted as the bailiff called for everyone to rise. Judge Raymond Harrington entered the courtroom with a swift, purposeful stride. In his late 60s, with steel-gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to having the final word. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice filling the room without seeming to raise it. As he settled into his chair, he began shuffling through papers, occasionally frowning at what he read. "First case, Gonzalez versus Westlake Development," the bailiff announced. Maria's heart jumped into her throat. She hadn't expected her case to be called first. Gathering her papers, she made her way to the front, acutely aware of eyes following her. At the plaintiff's table sat 3 people, all from the development company. A middle-aged man with a perfectly tailored suit and 2 younger attorneys, a man and woman, both equipped with sleek laptops and tablets. Maria took her place at the defendant's table, alone with her notepad and folder of papers. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Judge Harrington looked up, his gaze moving between the 2 tables. His eyes lingered on Maria, taking in her simple clothes and handwritten notes with a barely concealed look of dismay. I see the plaintiff is represented by counsel, he noted, nodding toward the development company's table. And Ms. Gonzalez, you are representing yourself today? Yes, Your Honor, Maria replied, her voice steady despite her nerves. The judge removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. Ms. Gonzalez, the court strongly advises defendants to seek proper legal representation, especially in property disputes where the law can be complex. I understand, Your Honor, but I couldn't afford. Yes, well, the judge cut her off, waving a hand dismissively. We'll proceed, but don't expect special accommodations because you've chosen to forego counsel. One of the Westlake attorneys, the younger man with a sharp haircut and sharper smile, leaned over to whisper something to his colleague, both of them smirking slightly. The lead attorney, a man named Henderson according to the nameplate before him, maintained a more professional demeanor, though his expression suggested he considered this case already won. Your Honor, Henderson began, rising smoothly from his chair. If I may, Westlake Development would like to present its case. We have extensive survey data, historical property records, and county documentation showing that the property line in question falls approximately 23 feet north of where Ms. Gonzalez believes it to be. Judge Harrington nodded. Proceed. For the next 45 minutes, Henderson and his team presented a polished argument complete with digital maps displayed on a courtroom screen, references to local ordinances, and testimony from a surveyor, who spoke with technical precision about GPS coordinates and boundary markers. Maria watched, taking careful notes, her brow furrowed in concentration. When Henderson mentioned a document she didn't recognize, she wrote down its name with a question mark beside it. Throughout the presentation, Judge Harrington remained attentive, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed his familiarity with property law. He addressed Henderson and his team with professional courtesy, nodding appreciatively at their well-structured arguments. When the development team finished, the judge turned to Maria. His expression had changed subtly. There was now a hint of pity mixed with impatience. Ms. Gonzalez, are you prepared to present your case? He asked, glancing at the clock as if already calculating how much time this would take. Maria stood, smoothing her blouse with slightly trembling hands. Yes, Your Honor. As she arranged her papers on the table before her, Henderson leaned back, in his chair, arms crossed in a posture of casual confidence. One of his associates was already packing up some of their materials, as if anticipating a quick resolution. Your Honor, Maria began, her voice growing steadier with each word. I'm not a lawyer or a professional speaker. I'm just trying to protect my home and the land my family has lived on for 3 generations. Judge Harrington's eyebrows rose slightly. Ms. Gonzalez, while I appreciate your personal attachment to the property, this court deals in legal facts, not sentimental value. Do you have actual evidence to counter the plaintiff's claims? A few people in the gallery exchanged glances, uncomfortable with the judge's tone. Maria's cheeks flushed, but she straightened her shoulders. I do have evidence, Your Honor, she replied, pulling out several yellow documents from her folder. I have the original deed to the property from 1962, signed and notarized when my grandfather purchased it. I also have photos showing the boundary markers that have been in place for decades, which were removed during the development company's initial excavation. The judge's expression remained skeptical as he motioned for her to approach and hand over the documents. He examined them with a cursory glance, his mouth set in a thin line. Ms. Gonzalez, these are certainly old documents, but age doesn't necessarily ensure accuracy. Survey methods have improved considerably since these were drawn up. If I could explain, Your Honor, Maria began. The court doesn't have time for lengthy explanations from non-professionals, Judge Harrington interrupted, returning the papers to her. If you have a legal argument based on current property law, please present it concisely. Maria returned to her table, feeling the weight of all eyes in the courtroom. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her notepad. The day was not going as she had hoped, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the judge had already made up his mind before hearing her full case. Little did anyone in that courtroom know that Maria's simple appearance and nervous demeanor concealed a depth of knowledge that would soon turn this seemingly straightforward case upside down. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, matching Maria's mood as she waited for the bus that would take her back to the courthouse. She had barely slept, replaying yesterday's events in her mind and wondering if she should have just accepted the developer's offer, meager as it was. The weight of doubt pressed down on her shoulders as heavily as the damp air. When Maria arrived, at the courthouse, the hallway outside courtroom 3B was already bustling. She spotted Henderson and his legal team huddled near a window, their heads bent together in conversation. They looked up as she passed, and Henderson offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good morning, Ms. Gonzalez," he said smoothly. "I hope you've reconsidered our settlement offer. Today might get technical." Maria clutched her bag tighter. "I've brought a few more documents that might clear things up," she replied, trying to match his confidence but hearing the slight waver in her own voice. The younger male attorney snickered quietly. "I'm sure your documents will be very enlightening," he said, his tone making it clear he thought the opposite. Maria felt her face grow warm but kept walking. She found a bench away from them and opened her bag, double-checking that she had everything she needed. Today she had brought not just her notes and the property deed, but also old family photos showing the boundary markers and a handwritten letter from her neighbor of 30 years confirming the property lines. The courtroom doors opened, and people began filing in. Maria waited until the Westlake team had entered before following, not wanting to walk beside them. Inside, she took her place at the defendant's table and arranged her materials, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. Judge Harrington entered promptly at 9, his face set in the same stern expression as the day before. After the formalities of opening court, he peered over his glasses at Maria. "Ms. Gonzalez, yesterday you were beginning to present your evidence regarding the property boundaries. The court reminds you that we need factual legal arguments, not emotional appeals. Do you wish to continue?" Maria stood, smoothing her simple navy skirt. Today she had dressed slightly more formally, though her outfit was still a far cry from the tailored suits across the aisle. "Yes, Your Honor. Thank you for allowing me to present my case." She reached for her first document, but her hand trembled slightly, causing her to drop several papers. As she bent to retrieve them, she heard a barely suppressed chuckle from the plaintiff's table. Judge Harrington sighed audibly. "Ms. Gonzalez, please try to be organized. The court's time is valuable." "I apologize, Your Honor," Maria said, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She finally gathered her documents and straightened them on the table. "Your Honor, I'd like to begin by addressing the survey that Westlake Development presented yesterday. While their survey is recent, I believe it contains an error regarding the northeastern boundary of my property." Judge Harrington raised an eyebrow. "An error? Are you suggesting that a professional survey conducted with modern equipment is less accurate than your personal understanding of where your property ends?" His tone made several people in the gallery shift uncomfortably, in their seats. The court reporter glanced up briefly before returning to her typing. "Not exactly, Your Honor," Maria replied, maintaining her composure despite the judge's dismissive tone. "I believe there's a discrepancy because their survey relied on a county marker that was moved during road construction in 1997. Henderson immediately stood. "Your Honor, this is pure speculation. Ms. Gonzalez has no expertise in surveying or property law. Our survey was conducted by licensed professionals using GPS technology." "I tend to agree," Judge Harrington said, nodding. "Ms. Gonzalez, do you have any actual evidence of this alleged marker movement, or is this just your personal theory?" Maria pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping. "I have an article from the local paper about the road widening project, Your Honor. It mentions that several property markers had to be repositioned, and I have photos of where the original marker was located." She approached the bench with the article and photos. Judge Harrington took them with visible reluctance, glancing at them briefly before handing them back. "Ms. Gonzalez, a newspaper article isn't a legal document, and these photos could have been taken anywhere. Do you have county records documenting this change?" Maria hesitated. "No, Your Honor. I tried to get those records, but the county office said they'd need time to find them in their archives, and my court date was already set." Judge Harrington leaned back in his chair, making it creak softly. "Then I'm afraid your argument lacks substantial evidence. Do you have anything else to present? Maria returned to her table, feeling a flicker of frustration. Yes, Your Honor. I have the original property deed from when my grandfather purchased the land, which includes specific measurements from landmarks that still exist. Approach, the judge said, extending his hand. Maria brought forward the deed, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. Judge Harrington examined it for several moments, his expression giving away nothing. This deed is quite old, Ms. Gonzalez. Property law has evolved significantly since this was drawn up. Modern surveys take precedence over historical documents, especially when the historical documents use outdated methods of measurement. He handed the deed back to her. Maria took it, trying not to show her disappointment. Your Honor, she began, I understand that modern methods are important, but shouldn't historical documents at least be considered? My family has lived on this property for 3 generations, and the boundaries have never been disputed until now. Judge Harrington's expression hardened. Ms. Gonzalez, this court deals with law, not family history. Longevity of ownership doesn't override proper legal documentation. From the plaintiff's table, Henderson stood again. Your Honor, if I may, it seems Ms. Gonzalez is lacking the legal expertise to understand the complexities of this case. Perhaps we could save the court's time by revisiting our settlement offer. Judge Harrington nodded approvingly. That might be wise, Ms. Gonzalez. Given the evidence presented so far, you might want to consider the plaintiff's offer. Maria felt a surge of indignation. Your Honor, with all due respect, I believe I have the right to present my full case before being advised to settle. The judge's eyebrows shot up at her tone. Watch yourself, Ms. Gonzalez. This court will not tolerate disrespect. I apologize, Your Honor, Maria said quickly. I didn't mean to sound disrespectful. I'm just trying to protect my property rights. Then I suggest you do so with proper legal arguments, Judge Harrington replied coldly. Continue with your presentation, but be aware that the court's patience is not infinite. Maria returned to her notes, feeling as if she were trying to swim against a powerful current. Every argument she presented was met with skepticism or outright dismissal. When she mentioned that the developer's heavy equipment had damaged her property before the boundary dispute even arose, Judge Harrington cut her off. That would be a separate civil complaint, Ms. Gonzalez, and not relevant to determining the actual property line. Please stay focused on the matter at hand. When she tried to introduce a letter from her longtime neighbor confirming the traditional boundary line, the judge declared it hearsay and inadmissible. By mid-morning, Maria was struggling to maintain her composure. It seemed that no matter what evidence she presented, Judge Harrington found reason to discount it. Meanwhile, Henderson and his team exchanged satisfied glances, occasionally making notes but largely sitting back as the judge did their work for them. During a brief recess, Maria retreated to a quiet corner of the hallway, trying to gather her thoughts. An elderly court clerk who had been watching the proceedings approached her. Don't give up, the woman whispered kindly. Judge Harrington can be tough, but he does listen eventually if you're persistent. Maria smiled gratefully. Thank you. I'm trying my best, but I feel like I'm speaking a different language than everyone else in there. The clerk patted her arm before walking away. Maria took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and returned to the courtroom, determined to continue despite the growing feeling that the outcome was predetermined. When court resumed, Judge Harrington seemed even more impatient than before. Ms. Gonzalez, do you have any further evidence to present, or can we move toward concluding this matter? Maria stepped forward, clutching a folder she hadn't yet opened. Your Honor, I have one more document I'd like to present. It's regarding legal precedent in similar boundary disputes. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. Henderson straightened in his chair, suddenly more attentive. Legal precedent? Judge Harrington repeated, a hint of condescension in his voice. Very well, let's hear about this precedent you believe applies. Maria opened the folder and removed several carefully highlighted pages. Your Honor, in researching this case, I found a similar situation in Wilkins County where a boundary dispute arose after road construction altered traditional markers. The case is Thornton v. Glazer, and the ruling established that historical Usage patterns should be given significant weight when modern surveys conflict with long-established boundaries. Judge Harrington's expression shifted from condescension to surprise. You're familiar with Thornton versus Glazer? Yes, Your Honor, Maria replied, gaining confidence from his reaction. The ruling specifically states that, when modern measurement conflicts with decades of unchallenged use, courts must consider whether the disruption of established boundaries serves the interests of justice. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even Henderson looked taken aback. The younger attorneys at his table were hurriedly typing on their tablets, presumably looking up the case Maria had cited. Judge Harrington studied Maria with new interest. That's a rather obscure case to have found in your research, Ms. Gonzalez. Most first-year law students wouldn't be familiar with it. Maria held his gaze. I spent a lot of time at the public library, Your Honor. They have a legal reference section. For the first time, a hint of respect flickered across the judge's face. Approach the bench with that citation, please. As Maria walked forward with her documents, she could feel the shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. Something had changed, and everyone present sensed it. By the time the afternoon session began, the atmosphere in courtroom 3B had grown noticeably tense. The morning's events had left everyone unsettled, particularly the Westlake Development legal team, who were now frantically shuffling through papers and whispering urgently to one another. Henderson's earlier smugness had evaporated, replaced by a tight-lipped concentration. Maria sat quietly at her table, taking slow, measured breaths to calm her racing heart. The morning had been brutal. She had endured hours of dismissive comments and barely concealed mockery. Yet she had persevered, and now something had shifted. She could feel it in the air, see it in the way the court clerk glanced at her with newfound curiosity, notice it in how the spectators in the gallery leaned forward when she spoke instead of slouching back with bored expressions. Judge Harrington rapped his gavel, calling the court back to order. His face betrayed nothing, but there was a subtle change in his posture, a slight lean forward that suggested genuine interest rather than obligatory attention. Ms. Gonzalez, you were discussing the Thornton versus Glazer precedent, he said, his tone neutral but lacking the condescension that had colored his earlier interactions with her. Please continue. Maria rose, clutching her notes. The paper trembled, slightly in her hands, but her voice was steady. Thank you, Your Honor. As I was explaining, Thornton versus Glazer established a 4-part test for determining property boundaries when historical usage conflicts with modern surveys. The first prong requires examining whether the historical boundaries were clearly marked and recognized by all parties for an extended period. She paused, flipping to a page of handwritten notes. In my case, the stone markers that have defined our property line for over 50 years were visible and undisputed until Westlake began construction. I have photographs of these markers from family gatherings dating back to 1978, showing they remained in the same location for decades. Henderson stood quickly. Your Honor, if I may interrupt, these photographs weren't submitted during discovery. We haven't had a chance to verify their authenticity. Judge Harrington considered this. Ms. Gonzalez, did you provide these photographs to the plaintiff's counsel before today? Maria's face fell slightly. No, Your Honor. I didn't realize I needed to share everything ahead of time. I'm sorry. I'm not familiar with all the rules. The judge nodded slowly. Normally, that would be grounds to exclude this evidence. However, he paused, seeming to weigh something in his mind. Given the circumstances and in the interest of getting to the truth of this matter, I'll allow it. Mr. Henderson, your objection is noted but overruled. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. This was a significant departure from the judge's earlier strict adherence to procedural rules when they disadvantaged Maria. Henderson's jaw tightened, but he sat down without further comment. Maria continued, her confidence growing slightly. The second prong of the Thornton test requires examining whether there was a clear moment when the disputed boundary was altered and whether that alteration was properly documented and communicated to all affected parties. She pulled out another document. I have here a county notice from 1997 regarding the road widening project. It states that property owners would be notified individually if their boundary markers needed to be relocated. My family never received such notification, suggesting that either our markers weren't moved Or if they were, it wasn't properly documented. Judge Harrington extended his hand, and Maria approached the bench to give him the notice. He studied it carefully, his expression thoughtful. "This appears to be a genuine county document," he said finally. "Mr. Henderson, was your client aware of this road project and its potential impact on the property lines?" Henderson shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, Westlake Development purchased this property only last year. They relied on the most recent survey data available, which was conducted after this road project was completed." The judge turned back to Maria. "Please continue with your explanation of the Thornton test, Ms. Gonzalez." "The third prong," Maria said, "requires examining whether enforcing a newly discovered boundary would create undue hardship for the party that has relied on the historical boundary. In my case, enforcing Westlake's new boundary would cut through my vegetable garden and remove apple trees my grandfather planted, which provide both sentimental value and practical food sources for my family." She hesitated, then added, "The fourth prong asks whether there's evidence of bad faith by either party. I would argue that Westlake's decision to begin construction and remove my trees before resolving this boundary dispute shows a disregard for established property rights and neighborhood harmony." One of the younger attorneys at the Westlake table whispered something to Henderson, who nodded and stood again. "Your Honor, while Ms. Gonzalez has made an interesting argument regarding Thornton versus Glazer, I must point out that the case she's citing dealt specifically with rural agricultural land, not residential property in a developing area. The precedent may not be directly applicable here." Judge Harrington raised an eyebrow. "Are you familiar with Franklin County Development Corp. versus Rodriguez, Mr. Henderson?" Henderson blinked, caught off guard. I'm not immediately recalling that case, Your Honor." "It was a 2014 appellate decision that extended the Thornton test to residential properties," the judge replied, his tone matter-of-fact. "I'm surprised your team didn't come across it in your preparation." Maria fought to keep her expression neutral, but inwardly, she felt a small surge of triumph. The dynamics in the courtroom were shifting before her eyes. Henderson recovered quickly. "We'll certainly review that case, Your Honor. However, I would also point out that modern property law generally favors precision over tradition. The GPS survey our client commissioned represents the most accurate technology available." "Technology isn't infallible, Mr. Henderson," Judge Harrington remarked, "especially when its reference points may have been compromised, as Ms. Gonzalez has suggested." He turned back to Maria. "Ms. Gonzalez, do you have anything else you wish to present regarding the boundary dispute?" Maria nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to address the matter of the easement that runs along the western edge of the property, which the plaintiff's survey doesn't account for." Judge Harrington's eyes narrowed with interest. "Easement?" There was no mention of an easement in the plaintiff's documentation. "That's correct, Your Honor," Maria said, pulling out another document from her folder. "There's a utility easement that was established in 1975 for underground water lines. It creates a 3-foot buffer zone where no permanent structures can be built. The easement follows the original property line." She approached the bench again, offering a yellow document with official stamps. The judge examined it thoroughly, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. "Mr. Henderson, were you aware of this easement?" he asked, looking up at the plaintiff's table. Henderson conferred hurriedly with his team. The younger female attorney shook her head vigorously. "Your Honor, this is the first we're hearing of this easement. We would request time to verify its existence and current status." Judge Harrington nodded. "That seems reasonable." He looked at his watch. "It's nearly 4 o'clock. I believe we should adjourn for today and resume tomorrow morning. This will give both parties time to review the information that has come to light." He turned to Maria. "Ms. Gonzalez, I must say I'm impressed by the thoroughness of your research, especially given your limited legal background." There was a subtle emphasis on the word limited that made Maria wonder if the judge was beginning to suspect there was more to her than met the eye. She simply nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor." As people began gathering their things, Henderson approached Maria's table. "Ms. Gonzalez," he said quietly, his tone considerably more respectful than it had been that morning. Perhaps we should discuss a revised settlement offer. I think we might be able to find a more equitable solution than what was previously proposed. Maria looked up at him, noting the new wariness in his eyes. I'm willing to listen, Mr. Henderson, but I'd prefer to wait until after tomorrow's session. I think the judge may have more questions about that easement. Henderson nodded stiffly and returned to his team, who immediately huddled around him in intense discussion. As Maria packed up her materials, the elderly court clerk who had encouraged her earlier passed by. Well done, she whispered with a smile. Not many people can cite Thornton v. Glazer from memory. Maria smiled back but said nothing. She finished gathering her things and walked out of the courtroom with her head held high, aware of the curious glances following her. The hallway outside seemed brighter somehow, despite the gray day visible through the windows. As she waited for the elevator, she overheard two young law interns discussing the case. Did you see Henderson's face when she pulled out that easement document? One whispered. Priceless. I don't get it, the other replied. How does someone who showed up in jeans yesterday know more case law than a team of corporate lawyers? Maria smiled to herself as she stepped into the elevator. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for the first time since this ordeal began, she felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps justice didn't always favor those with the most expensive suits and the fanciest technology after all. The courthouse seemed different to Maria the next morning. The imposing stone columns no longer felt intimidating, but rather like silent witnesses to a story unfolding within their walls. As she climbed the steps, a young law student who had been watching the proceedings hurried to hold the door open for her. That was amazing yesterday, the student said quietly. Are you really representing yourself? Maria just smiled and thanked her for the door. She had learned that sometimes saying less was more powerful than saying too much. The hallway outside courtroom 3B was buzzing with activity. Word had spread about the unexpected turns in what should have been a straightforward property dispute. Several people nodded at Maria as she passed, and she heard whispers follow in her wake. That's her. The woman who cited Thornton v. Glazer. From memory, I heard she found an easement the developers didn't know about. My cousin works at the clerk's office and said Judge Harrington was asking about her after court yesterday. Maria kept her eyes forward, clutching her worn leather bag a little tighter. Inside were the same documents as yesterday, plus one new folder she had stayed up late preparing. The lack of sleep showed in the slight shadows under her eyes, but there was a new steadiness in her step that hadn't been there before. Henderson and his team were already at the plaintiff's table when Maria entered the courtroom. The atmosphere was markedly different from previous days. Instead of casual chatter and confident smiles, the Westlake attorneys were huddled in serious conversation, occasionally glancing up as Maria took her seat at the defendant's table. Most notably, there was a new addition to their team, an older man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses who carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to announce his importance. Maria recognized him immediately as Thomas Whitfield, a senior partner from Henderson's firm whose reputation in property law was well known throughout the state. Henderson approached Maria's table before the judge arrived. Ms. Gonzalez, he said, his tone cordial but guarded. We've reviewed our position overnight and would like to propose a new settlement. We're prepared to adjust the boundary line to match the historical markers and offer compensation for the damaged trees. Maria looked up at him, noting the tension around his eyes. That sounds promising, Mr. Henderson. What about the garden area? We can discuss including that as well, he conceded. Perhaps we could speak during the lunch recess? Before Maria could respond, the bailiff called for everyone to rise as Judge Harrington entered. The judge seemed different today, more alert, more focused. His eyes scanned the courtroom, pausing briefly on the new attorney at the Westlake table before settling on Maria. Was there a hint of curiosity in his gaze now? Be seated, he said, arranging his papers. Before we continue with testimony, I understand the plaintiff has some new information to share with the court. Henderson stood. Yes, Your Honor. After yesterday's session, we conducted our own research into the utility easement Ms. Gonzalez mentioned. We can confirm that such an easement does exist and was properly recorded with the county in 1975. He glanced briefly at the senior partner beside him before continuing. In light of this information, Westlake Development is willing to revise its claim regarding the property boundary to accommodate this easement and the historical markers that Ms. Gonzalez has documented. Judge Harrington raised an eyebrow. That's quite a change in position, Mr. Henderson. Yes, Your Honor. We believe it's in everyone's best interest to find an equitable solution based on all available facts. I see. The judge turned to Maria. Ms. Gonzalez, do you wish to respond to this offer? Maria rose slowly. Your Honor, while I appreciate Mr. Henderson's willingness to acknowledge the easement and historical boundaries, I'm concerned that we haven't addressed the damage already done to my property. The apple trees that were removed cannot be replaced overnight. They were planted by my grandfather and had both sentimental and practical value. Judge Harrington nodded thoughtfully. A valid concern. Mr. Henderson, does your client's offer include compensation for these damages? We're prepared to offer reasonable compensation, Your Honor, Henderson replied. The specific amount would need to be negotiated, but we recognize our responsibility to make this right. The judge made a note. Very well. Now, before we proceed further, there's another matter I'd like to address. He fixed Maria with a direct look. Ms. Gonzalez, your knowledge of property law and legal precedent seems quite extensive for someone without formal legal training. May I ask how you came to be so well versed in these matters? A hush fell over the courtroom. This was the question that had been on everyone's mind since yesterday afternoon. Maria felt dozens of eyes on her waiting for her response. She took a deep breath. Your Honor, before I answer, may I ask why this is relevant to my case? A few gasps echoed through the gallery. Questioning a judge's line of inquiry was a bold move. Judge Harrington didn't appear offended. If anything, a flicker of respect crossed his face. It's not directly relevant to the boundary dispute, Ms. Gonzalez. However, this court has an interest in ensuring that all parties are forthright about their backgrounds and qualifications. Maria nodded. I understand, Your Honor. The truth is quite simple. Before moving back to care for my mother 5 years ago, I was a professor of constitutional law at Georgetown University, specializing in property rights and land use regulation. I've published several articles on the evolution of easement law and historical property boundaries. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Henderson's jaw actually dropped, and even the senior partner beside him looked taken aback. Judge Harrington banged his gavel once, restoring order. Dr. Gonzalez, I presume? The judge asked, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and something that might have been embarrassment. Dr. Gonzalez Sullivan is my full professional name, Your Honor, though I've been using my maiden name since returning to my childhood home. I see. Judge Harrington adjusted his glasses, clearly processing this revelation. May I ask why you didn't disclose your background when this case began? Maria's expression remained calm. Your Honor, I believed then, as I still do now, that cases should be judged on their merits, not on the credentials of those involved. My property rights aren't more or less valid because of my education. The judge was silent for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. A principled position, Dr. Gonzalez Sullivan, though perhaps not entirely practical in our legal system, which often relies on credentials as shortcuts for credibility. He shuffled his papers, visibly gathering his thoughts. In light of this information and the plaintiff's willingness to revise their position, I believe we should recess for 1 hour to allow both parties to discuss a potential settlement. Does that seem reasonable? Both Maria and Henderson agreed, and the judge dismissed court until 11 o'clock. In the hallway outside, Maria found herself surrounded by curious onlookers, including several law students who had been following the case. She politely declined to answer questions, making her way to a quiet corner where she could gather her thoughts. Henderson approached with his senior colleague. Dr. Gonzalez Sullivan, he said, the formal title now replacing the dismissive Ms. he had used previously. This is Thomas Whitfield, our firm's senior partner. The older attorney extended his hand. It's an honor to meet you, Doctor. I believe I cited your article on contested easements in the Parker case last year. Had I known you were the opposing party here, He let the sentence trail off. Implications clear. Mr. Whitfield, Maria acknowledged, shaking his hand. I'm still just a homeowner defending her property rights. Shall we discuss that settlement? They moved to a conference room where Whitfield took the lead in negotiations. The dynamics couldn't have been more different from the initial offer made by the young attorney in the expensive suit. There was respect now, careful attention to details, and a genuine effort to find a fair solution. By the time they returned to the courtroom, they had reached an agreement that restored Maria's original property line, provided compensation for the damaged trees and garden, and included a written apology from Westlake Development. Additionally, the company agreed to plant new apple trees under Maria's supervision and to install a decorative stone wall along the property line that would preserve the character of the neighborhood. As they presented the settlement to Judge Harrington, Maria noticed the court clerk smiling broadly at her from her station. Even the bailiff seemed to stand a little straighter when addressing her. Judge Harrington reviewed the agreement carefully. This seems quite comprehensive and fair to both parties. Before I approve it, I want to ensure that everyone understands its terms. Dr. Gonzalez-Sullivan, do you have any questions or concerns about this settlement? No, Your Honor, Maria replied. I believe it addresses all the issues fairly. The judge nodded. Mr. Henderson? Mr. Whitfield? We are satisfied with the terms, Your Honor, Whitfield answered. Westlake Development acknowledges that mistakes were made and is committed to being a better neighbor going forward. Judge Harrington made one final note before looking up. Then I hereby approve this settlement and commend both parties for finding a resolution. This case is dismissed. He banged his gavel, making it official. As people began to file out, Judge Harrington called out, Dr. Gonzalez-Sullivan, might I have a word with you in my chambers? Maria nodded, curious about what the judge wanted to say in private. As she gathered her belongings, she couldn't help but notice how differently everyone now looked at her. Not with pity or dismissal, but with newfound respect and even admiration. The simple woman in worn clothes had disappeared in their eyes, replaced by the accomplished legal scholar she had always been. Yet Maria knew she was both of these people, and it was her experiences living simply in her childhood home, working at the local diner, and connecting with her community that had enriched her understanding of the law in ways that academic achievement alone never could. Maria followed Judge Harrington through a side door that led to a narrow hallway behind the courtroom. The space had that distinct government building smell, a mix of old paper, wood polish, and coffee. Their footsteps echoed on the tile floor as the bailiff led them to the judge's chambers. The room was smaller than Maria had imagined, lined with bookshelves full of leather-bound volumes and law texts. Framed diplomas and family photos decorated the walls, humanizing the stern man who had presided over her case. A large wooden desk dominated the space, with stacks of case files neatly arranged at one corner. Please have a seat, Judge Harrington said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. The formality of the courtroom had softened somewhat, though he maintained his professional demeanor. Maria settled into the chair, placing her worn leather bag beside her. She waited quietly as the judge took his seat and removed his glasses, setting them carefully on the desk between them. Dr. Gonzalez-Sullivan, he began, then paused, seeming to search for the right words. I owe you an apology. Maria hadn't expected this direct acknowledgement. She remained silent, allowing him to continue. My treatment of you during the early stages of this proceeding was unprofessional and, frankly, beneath the standards this court should uphold. He met her eyes directly. I made assumptions based on your appearance and apparent background that colored my perception of your arguments. That was wrong of me. Maria nodded slightly. Thank you for acknowledging that, Your Honor. The judge leaned back in his chair. I've been on the bench for 27 years. I'd like to think I've always been fair, but your case has been illuminating. It's forced me to recognize biases I didn't want to admit I had. He gestured toward his bookshelf. I have 3 of your articles on that shelf, you know. Your work on historical easements and indigenous property rights has influenced several of my rulings over the years. Yet when you stood before me in simple clothes with a handwritten notebook, I failed to see past the surface. Maria smiled slightly. We all make judgments based on appearances, Your Honor. It's human nature. The question is whether we're willing to revise those judgments when presented with new information. Indeed. The judge picked up a pen from his desk, turning it thoughtfully in his fingers. May I ask why? Why not simply introduce yourself as Dr. Gonzalez Sullivan from the beginning? It would have changed the entire dynamic of the case. Maria took a moment to consider her answer. When I moved back here to care for my mother, I made a conscious choice to simplify my life. I started working at the diner, reconnected with old neighbors, and became part of the community as just Maria. She smoothed a wrinkle in her skirt. When this boundary dispute arose, I wanted to be treated like any other homeowner facing a powerful developer, not as a former law professor with connections and credentials. A test, the judge observed. Not of you specifically, Maria clarified. Of the system. I've taught about equal protection and justice for decades, written papers about how the law should work the same for everyone regardless of status. I wanted to see if that was true in practice. A wry smile crossed Judge Harrington's face. And we failed that test rather spectacularly, didn't we? Initially, Maria acknowledged. But the outcome was ultimately fair. The judge nodded slowly. Only because you had the knowledge to force it to be fair. What about those who don't have your background? The actual everyday people you were pretending to be? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Maria had asked herself the same thing many times during the case. That's why I wanted to speak with you, Judge Harrington continued. I'm establishing a committee to review accessibility issues in our county court system. How we can better serve those without legal training or resources. Would you consider joining as an advisor? Your unique perspective would be invaluable. Maria hadn't expected this turn. I'd be honored, Your Honor. It's an important issue. Good. The judge seemed genuinely pleased. There's something else I wanted to discuss. The law school at the State University has an opening for a visiting professor next semester, teaching a course on property rights and social justice. The dean is an old colleague of mine. When I mentioned your name, he was quite excited at the possibility. Are you offering me a job, Judge Harrington? Maria asked with a hint of amusement. Merely making a connection, he replied. The choice would be entirely yours. But it would be a shame for students to miss out on learning from someone with both your academic credentials and your recent practical experience. Maria considered this. She had enjoyed her simpler life these past few years, but she also missed teaching. Perhaps there was a way to blend both worlds. I'll think about it, she promised. The judge nodded and rose from his chair, signaling the end of their conversation. One last thing, Dr. Gonzalez Sullivan. The court reporter tells me you took the bus to court each day. Yes, Maria confirmed. I never saw the need for a car, when everything I need is within walking distance or a bus ride away. Would you allow me to drive you home today? It would give me a chance to see the property that started all this, and perhaps continue our conversation about court reform. The request surprised Maria, but she saw the genuine interest behind it. That would be fine, Your Honor. Raymond, he corrected her with a small smile. We're not in court anymore. As they left the courthouse together 20 minutes later, Maria noticed several reporters waiting on the steps. Word had spread quickly about the unusual case and its surprising twist. A young woman with a press badge stepped forward. Dr. Gonzalez Sullivan, can you comment on today's settlement? Is it true you're a former Georgetown professor? Maria paused. The terms of the settlement are fair to both parties. That's all I wish to say on the matter. She continued down the steps with Judge Harrington beside her. The reporter persisted, walking alongside them. What made you decide to represent yourself without revealing your background? This question made Maria stop. She looked at the young reporter thoughtfully. Everyone deserves equal treatment under the law, she said simply. Your job title, education, or clothes shouldn't determine whether you receive justice. Sometimes, we need reminders of that, even those of us who work within the system. With that, she continued walking, leaving the reporter to consider her words. Judge Harrington's car was a modest sedan, clean, but showing its age. As they drove through town toward Maria's small house, their conversation shifted to more personal matters. "What made you leave academia for small-town life?" he asked. Maria gazed out the window at the familiar streets. "My mother's health was declining, and this is where my roots are. But honestly, I was also growing frustrated with teaching theory without seeing its application in everyday life. Writing papers for other scholars to read didn't seem enough anymore." The judge nodded in understanding. "And the diner job?" Maria smiled. "That was unexpected. I stopped in for coffee my first week back and they were short-handed. I offered to help for a day, and somehow it turned into 5 years. There's something satisfying about cooking food that brings people together, listening to their stories, being part of a community in a tangible way." As they turned onto her street, Maria pointed out her modest house with its large garden. The contrast with the luxury development next door was striking. Simple, lived-in comfort versus polished, manicured newness. Judge Harrington parked in her driveway, and they both got out to inspect the property line that had caused so much trouble. The stone markers were still visible, weathered by decades of sun and rain. "My grandfather placed these when he first bought the land," Maria explained, touching one of the stones. "He always said boundaries should be clear, but not divisive. That's why he never built a fence." The judge looked thoughtful. "Wise man." They walked to the damaged area where the trees had been removed. Fresh soil marked where new saplings would be planted according to the settlement. "It won't be the same in my lifetime," Maria said, looking at the empty spaces. "Those trees took decades to mature, but at least future generations will have shade here again." Judge Harrington looked at her with new respect. "You know, your case will change how I approach my courtroom. I've already decided to implement new procedures to ensure self-represented litigants are given proper consideration." "That's a good start," Maria encouraged him. As they completed their tour of the property, Maria's elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, called out from her porch next door. "Maria, did you win your case?" Maria waved back with a smile. "Yes, Mrs. Chen. Everything turned out fine." The old woman beamed. "I knew you would show them. Who's your friend?" "This is Judge Harrington," Maria replied. "He's giving me a ride home." Mrs. Chen's eyes widened with interest. "The judge himself. Come in, both of you. I just made fresh lemonade." Judge Harrington looked surprised by the invitation, but not displeased. "I'd be delighted if Dr. Gonzalez-Sullivan doesn't mind." "It's just Maria here," she corrected him gently. "And Mrs. Chen's lemonade is the best in the county. You don't want to miss it." As they walked toward the neighboring house, Maria reflected on the strange journey of the past few days. From being dismissed and humiliated to being respected and heard, all while remaining essentially the same person. What had changed wasn't her, but how others perceived her. And perhaps that was the most important lesson of all, that worth and dignity shouldn't depend on titles or appearances, but on the fundamental humanity we all share. That evening, long after Judge Harrington had left with promises of future collaboration, Maria sat on her porch watching the sunset. She held an old photo of her grandfather standing proudly by the apple trees that would now be replanted. "We did it, abuelo," she whispered to the fading light. "Justice doesn't always come easily, but sometimes it comes." And in courtrooms across the county in the months that followed, attorneys would whisper the story to their clients, the tale of the simple woman who taught a powerful lesson to everyone who underestimated her.